pardon?
Yeah.
For organizing this panel. And I hope that we'll have a great conversation with emerging leaders on one side and established leaders on the other. Welcome.
Okay, and that's a warm welcome from my side as well. My name is Emily Gordine. I'm a political correspondent for Deutsche Welle in Berlin. Now, I'm here with three fantastic guests. On my left is Mr. Tatsuya Terazawa. He is the chairman and CEO of the Institute of Energy Economics in Japan. Welcome, and thank you for being here. Then furthermore, we have Mr. Peter Bean. He is a senator in Canada, and he is also the former ambassador of Canada to Germany. So another warm re-welcome, I guess, to Germany and to Munich, and thank you so much for being here. And then last but not least, Mr. Sheldon Whitehouse, the US Senator for Rhode Island. You've come a long way as well. Thank you so much for being here today. Well, we'll jump right in then, seeing that we also want to leave plenty of questions for the end. Now, we know that on an environmental spectrum, time is running out. The world is getting hotter, and right now we're seeing a huge run on green technology and green energy. And especially in Europe, over-reliance on suppliers such as Russia has additionally proven economically ill-fated and has sped up this transition. But all of this isn't happening in a vacuum. It is happening at a time of great economic power reshuffle. Now, Mr. Terazawa, I'd like to start with you. Japan has arguably been foot-dragging a little when it comes to investing in green energy. Does that have political or geopolitical reasons?
Well,
You might want to use that mic.
Well, thank you very much for having me in this panel. I think my presence from Japan shows that the geopolitical questions is not just within a transatlantic angle, but we have the Indo-Pacific angle as well. And if I can provide a view from Japan to this discussion, that would be my great honor. And try to answer your question, the foot dragging, that is certainly the way we are portrayed by some players, but actually we are committed for the NDC, National Determined Contribution, reduction by 46% of greenhouse gas emission reduction by 2030. So we are committed with the reduction of the GHG. Having said so, the reason why we may be criticized for that foot dragging, which I do not disagree, is for maybe 2 or 3 reasons. One is that after the Fukushima nuclear accident, we had to shut down all the nuclear power plants, at the time providing probably about nearly 40% of the power in 2011, and we have to scramble to construct thermal power plants, both gas and coal in place. And we are, after 2011, we have been trying to restart our nuclear power plants, but it is time consuming. We have succeeded in restarting 12 nuclear power plants out of nearly 60 nuclear units we had at the time of the Fukushima nuclear accident in 2011. So that is the biggest challenge we have in trying to phase out the fossil fuel power generation. We love to do so, but we have to face the reality. So it's not political or geopolitical, it is the reality we are facing. We have to ensure that we provide the sufficient amount of power to support our industry and our people. That's number one. Number two is that we don't have fossil fuels in Japan, which is a pity, but we also have very limitation in the potential of renewable energies. One is that we have been deploying solar panels aggressively, especially after the Fukushima nuclear accident. We put into place a feed-in tariff system so generous that we had a very dramatic increase in the deployment of solar panels in Japan. And on a per flat land basis, Japan is by far the most intensive place of deployment of solar power, because Japan is much smaller than Canada or the US, and 70% of our land are mountains. So if you look at flat land, it's very limited, and that limited flat land, we are deploying the largest concentration of solar panels. So we are committed to the goal. We are trying to do our best facing those constraints, but both from the constraints from the renewable side and both from the constraints of that suspension of nuclear power plants, we are facing that kind of reality. And but I would like to stress that we are trying to do our best, and beyond that, we are trying to spread the technology and finance for our neighboring Asian countries, especially the Southeast Asian countries, to reduce their CO2 emission. And the global climate issue is a global challenge. We should reduce our GHG in Japan, but considering Southeast Asia as the growth center of the world, I believe that we can do a great contribution to the global climate by helping those Asian countries to grow while reducing their GHG emission. So this is my answer to your tough questions to start with.
Thank you for trying to answer. Now, Senator Boom, I wonder, in Canada, how fast is the transition to green energies happening there, and does the speed also have to do with the geopolitical situation at the moment?
Yes, is the answer. No. Grüß Gott, ich freue mich, wieder in Amerika Haus zu sein. It's, as everything on the energy side, it's complicated. We're in a very large country. We are a producer of oil and gas. We have one large market to the south of us. I'm not sure, is this working? No, it's working, okay. And of course we have our domestic market. There's pipelines are being built, so we're going to be open to export to Japan, for example, and we have an agreement with Japan. But at the same time, we have some goals that we want to achieve related to the Paris Agreement and also to renewables. Also, at the same time, we're looking at reacting or anticipating what is happening south of the border. So the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, was a stimulus to us in policy making terms to come up with more investment and a more aggressive approach to what we can do domestically. And much of that has been focused on renewables and in building battery plants. We used to be a big producer of rare earths and critical minerals, and slowed down on that and almost eliminated it because the extraction is also not very friendly in environmental terms. So you try to have one thing on the one hand and another on the other. Also in the North American context, we are doing more things together. So we call it the CUSMA in Canada, it's USMCA. That is up for renegotiation and another look in 2026. So we have to anticipate that with our American friends and also with our Mexican friends. By the same token, we're looking at hydrogen. We have a green hydrogen agreement with Germany that was signed by the Chancellor and the Prime Minister, but that is mainly an East Coast focus. So we have all of that going on, but we're also, despite climate change, we have tremendous variances in climate. So to have a grid across the country where we can recharge electric vehicles, that is proving a little bit more difficult to achieve. And we also have many remote communities. On the political side, domestically, it is one of these so-called hot potato issues. The government is in a minority government position, and that means, at least in our system, it could fall at any time, but it also means that the policy planning focal point is closer in than it would be in terms of planning more for the future. And we have an official opposition that has adopted a very simple slogan, which is axe the tax, meaning the carbon tax, which is a tax that is imposed in Canada, but it also has rebates. And the government, in my view, has to do a better job in terms of selling that to people, because they think they are being unfairly taxed. On the other hand, again, climate change is proving that there are tremendous difficulties related to events that you can't control. Forest fires in northern Quebec, in a remote area that we could not even get water bombers to quite readily, blanketed parts of Canada and the United States with smoke last year. And the low snowpack and snowfall over this winter indicates it's going to be a very arid and dry summer again. So it is all about balance. The politics enter into it somewhat. What will happen in Senator, in your elections in 2024 this year, that's going to be significant as well. So I wanted to open with some themes of uncertainty there.
Well, thank you very much. Senator Whitehouse, I do wonder that if the world stopped investing into green energy, do you think that would make the world a safer place?
If the world stopped investing into green energy?
Mm-hmm.
No, it would make it an infinitely more dangerous place. It's already quite a dangerous place, and that would make it a great deal worse. For innumerable reasons, not the least of which is that very big fossil fuel provider countries tend to become very belligerent because they have the resources, often centrally controlled by the government, to become very belligerent. Witness Russia and Iran.
So do we even have an alternative? Do we have an alternative to, because we're saying, green investments, it is creating a certain amount of competition around the world.
Yeah.
And that is making, it is causing political friction in some areas, or it is creating competition that is affecting political relations.
Yeah.
So, but with what you said, does that mean we don't have an alternative to investing in green technologies?
Not one that the species would survive very well. I think our predicament is that we are right now not on a pathway to climate safety, and with present political inputs, there's no pathway to climate safety. So we're headed to climate failure, and that's going to have very dire consequences. So something has to change. America added a very big subsidy push on the clean energy side. Canada, as the Senator mentioned, has had a bit of a pull with the carbon tax on the fossil energy side. I think we need to do both. And I am a very ardent supporter of the European Union's CBAM as sending that signal internationally and eliminating some of the competition problems and free rider problems. So with the UK joining the EU CBAM, that adds even more impetus. I would not be surprised if the CBAM was joined by Canada at some point. I think a lot of what's holding Canada back is consideration for the big southern brother, and Japan perhaps also, Australia perhaps also. It's hard to know how that works. A lot will depend on the signal, the political signal at home of companies that find they're being tariffed internationally and would like to rid themselves of the tariffs. And they will, I think, have the incentive to defeat fossil fuels' political hegemony in at least the United States Congress.
You want to jump in? Absolutely, please do.
First, to your initial question, and then next to Senator Whitehouse's comment. You mentioned the lack of investment in Japan, but IRA reminded me that Prime Minister Kishida introduced a new strategy called a GX strategy. We thought GX was a part of the English vocabulary, but we found it was not. GX stands for Green Transformation. And the pledge is to realize a total of 150 trillion yen, like 1.1 trillion US dollars for the next 10 years, both from the public sector and private sector, out of which 20 trillion yen will be coming from the government. And it will be financed by the carbon pricing system that is scheduled to be introduced in Japan. So getting back to your question, are we not investing in green technology?
I didn't say that. I said foot dragging.
Foot dragging, but it sounds the same. I'm a visitor from far away, and the first word of welcome was very critical. But I would stress that we are doing this for the global climate, but also we are doing for our industry as well. So we have to look at the future of the industry and also for the future of our planet. And getting back to your point about the control of fossil fuel by dictators or authoritarian leaders, it's a huge threat to us. We do import some energy from Russia, and we understand the necessity to reduce our dependence on Russian energy. But we need to have an alternative. Yes, for the long term and midterm, we are investing in renewable energies, but it will take some time. And in between, we would need to have some natural gas. And that's the reason why we are engaged in a LNG import from Canada. In order to reduce our dependence on Russian energy, especially natural gas or LNG, we have to find somewhere else. And for us, one candidate is Canada, the other is United States. With the abundance of natural gas in the US, from us, US seems to be a very potential, strong candidate to export LNG for us to replace the Russian energy. But this is a difficult question. I'm not saying which is right. Reducing dependence on Russia, which is important for energy security reasons. And there is also an argument that we should reduce our dependence on fossil fuel. Long term, midterm, I agree, but in the meantime, we have to find alternative. And that's where I think there will be a dilemma, especially in the US, how to balance these two policy objectives of reducing our dependence on Russia, but also trying to reduce our dependence on fossil fuel. And that's the challenge we're facing in reality. So that's a response, a comment to his comment.
Well, thank you very much for clearing that up. Now, we've now heard from all of you that there's lots of investments in green energy. Basically, you don't really have a choice. Transition is a bit difficult. But all of these investments are creating competition. And I reckon, well, my question is, in each country, how do you feel that competition affecting political relations? Or, because I want to go back to the geopolitical issues that we face today, especially in relationship to China. So I wonder, Mr. Terrazzo, maybe we'll start with you again. What are the direct, like, where do competition and geopolitical tensions intersect for Japan?
Well, I had been working for the Japanese government, and actually I was responsible to respond to the rare earth embargo that took place in 2010. For those of you, most of the audience are young, so 2010 seems to be far away. Maybe many of you may not have been born or a small child then. What happened in 2010 was that in the South China, the East China Sea, there was a Senkaku Islands under the Japanese territory, and the Chinese fishing boat was approaching the territorial waters, and our Coast Guard tried to prevent them from entering into the territorial waters of Japan, but the Chinese fishing boat collided into the Japanese Coast Guard vessels, and naturally the Japanese Coast Guard arrested the captain of the Chinese fishing boat. That's natural, but the Chinese response was very harsh. And one of their approach was to stop the export of rare earth to Japan. At the time when I was working at the government, I had no knowledge about rare earth, but that embargo paralyzed the production of automobiles because rare earths are used for magnets and used for motors. So that embargo paralyzed the auto industry in Japan, which was very important. That was back in 2010. Before people talk about supply chain resilience or economic security, we faced that in 2010. As we make our transition to the clean, greener technology, which we should do, the result would be a massive, massive demand for the critical minerals, including rare earths. And currently, the processing of critical minerals are almost exclusively dominated by China. So what would happen is that as we make this energy transition, which we should do, the demand for critical minerals would explode. And if policies are not taken, that supply will be dominated by China. And as we were target of weaponization of overdependence back in 2010, it could be used again as a weapon to any country. Next time, it may not be Japan, it may be other countries. For your reference, since most of you are in Europe, you may not know, but a similar thing happened to Australia when the Australian Prime Minister made this comment that there has to be an international study onto the origin of COVID-19, which was a fair argument. But the response from China was to stop import of Australian wine. So economic means can be used for economic coercion. And this dependence on critical minerals, which will be much worse as we go through this clean energy transition, will be potentially affects the economic security of any country, including US, Canada, Japan, and other countries. So this is an issue which needs to be addressed by countries, like-minded countries, countries with the same concern. And this is something I'm happy to discuss, but this is one aspect of geopolitics coming into this clean energy transition issue.
Thank you very much. Mr. Beam, Senator Beam, would you expand on that? Like, have you experienced similar issues with China when it comes to, for example,
Hasn't everyone? We had a situation a couple years ago where we responded to an extradition request from the United States to detain the CFO of Huawei, and that led to lots of repercussions, including the taking of our citizens, the imposition of a ban on canola oil exports and the like. And we've managed to get the relationship out of the deep freeze, but it's still in the cool, crisper part of the refrigerator right now. But there are, I think there are broader concerns, because if you are investing in green energy, it takes time, and we don't have that much time on our side. So, for example, on green hydrogen, you have to look at the production facility, having the infrastructure, how to transport it, the local concerns. In the case of my country, we're probably the most decentralized democracy in the world. So our provinces own the rights to the mineral resources. So that means in negotiation, you could have governments of different political stripes at the federal level and at the provincial level. There are concerns that we always have about our indigenous peoples, who are the traditional owners of the land as well. And then you have surprises, and sometimes tariffs can be imposed. We have a very weak World Trade Organization as well that will need some support and restructuring. And often local concerns emerge in the political landscape. So these are all big factors if you want to move quickly. And for example, I mentioned rare earths before. Problem, of course, also for us. And when you look at where a lot of chips and things are made, well, that's Taiwan. And that becomes a geopolitical question, I think partly responsible for the US passing the so-called CHIPS Act as well. So many of the governments, and certainly I think all three on the stage here, are very conscious of that. But you also have a very restless post-pandemic electorate that has a distrust in democratic institutions, not just nationally, but the ones that we have used to set up the international rules-based order.
Thank you very much. Senator Whitehouse, would you like to add the geopolitical tensions that you felt with, for example, China in regards to green technology, green investments, green energy?
Not particularly, because I think that the international tussling that we've talked about is more or less completely overwhelmed and drowned out by the massive violation by the fossil fuel industry of the elementary economic law that the cost of the harms of a product ought to be baked into the price of a product, that a negative externality, as economists call it, is a subsidy, and that in a market economy you don't want subsidies. In the US, the International Monetary Fund just calculated the subsidy for fossil fuel last year at $660 billion. 1 year, one country. So when you are trying to put a push behind clean energy and you're running against a tide of hundreds of billions of dollars every single year in subsidy for fossil fuel, that distorts markets worldwide. And nobody has beaten that. The people who have the best carbon pricing have the best offsets, and we're working our way towards that. But I'm willing to put up with a lot of intramural tussling when disputes turn into economic and trade disputes. And if you can get rid of that overarching problem, because that's why we are where we are. The fossil fuel industry has created a business model of violating Economics 101 and taking the harms of their product and putting that onto the public, and then using politics to defend that. And if you have $600 billion that you're defending, it's very easy to put quite a lot of money into politics. And unfortunately, the United States has made it very easy by making unlimited spending and secret unlimited spending both legal.
Well, I mean, we know that, one second, well, we know that, green technology is, started off as just, something that you might think of as goodwill, but actually there's a huge economic interest behind it. Now I do wonder though, because, let's say that the 90s, 2000s, companies would be able to do more or less, we're very much free to do business wherever they want to, and now the situation has changed because politics has entered the discussion much more. And I do wonder, for example, when it comes to investments, how much politics is too much politics in economics?
Well, good luck getting the politics out of this economics at this scale. And in fact, the reason we're in the problem we're in is because the politics have been distorted and twisted by the economics and the huge subsidy and the desire to protect that subsidy that puts, if you're the US fossil fuel industry and you spend $6 billion a year influencing Congress, 435 of us, every single year, 535 of us, counting the Senate, of course, then you're earning $100 for every dollar you invest every single year. That's a bigger return on investment than their actual product is. So the campaign to protect its subsidy is probably the biggest thing of the fossil fuel industry, bigger than its actual fossil fuel production in terms of return. So it's really hard to unpack the political from the economic, but I think the elephant in the room, the biggest thing, is the fossil fuel industry refuses to obey the laws of economics, and it uses politics to exempt itself from the laws of economics. And so we are all paying in our atmosphere, in our world, in our oceans, the price that should have been in the price of their product for the last 30, 40 years. And a lot of decisions that have been made that have given them hegemony politically and hegemony in the fossil fuel portion of the energy market relate to all of those years of subsidy and advantage that have accrued. We'd be in a very, very different position if they'd been playing by the laws of economics from the beginning.
Laws of economics. I mean, if you look at, I want to turn the conversation around a little bit because I'd like to, for example, get back to, I know you're not from European countries, but I'd like to take up a European problem here, for example. Electric vehicles, electric cars, right? I mean, we're in Germany, Germans love cars, but we're not very good at e-cars. We're not very good at electric vehicles so far. The Chinese are arguably better than us. So do we start protecting our industries? Is that what Europe should do to protect its industries, shield off the good Chinese cars? Or should we not? What risks do we run if we say we don't want any more Chinese cars in Europe? Maybe we'll start with Senator Beam, actually. It's okay, because you know Germany.
I have not seen a single Chinese car in Germany, so I've been looking around on my trip this time too, so I haven't seen it. I think what's happening is that the technology is advancing so quickly and expansion. So if you look at one company, if you look at Tesla, the models that are being produced now are very different than a few years ago. I remember when I was ambassador here and I went to Wolfsburg and we had to sign a non-disclosure agreement to be part of a test of the first electric Golf, Volkswagen. And that was in 2010 or something like that. So, and it was all batteries in the back. Now batteries are getting smaller, they're getting much more sophisticated. The range of cars that they would have in a charge is getting longer, except if it's really cold. So if we have a few days of -20 in Canada, a car that could go 400 kilometers might only be able to go half that. And that's not good enough for us. So that is a challenge for governments that are trying to promote electric vehicles, and we're doing that in collaboration with the United States, and we'll be doing it in collaboration with Volkswagen as well. It remains a big challenge, and then no one really talks about the disposal of batteries when they become obsolete, which I would think is a big issue as well as we go ahead. So just a couple thoughts there.
But again, like for me, I think that, and that's something I think that a lot of European countries, but maybe the US and Canada as well, face, is that we have been asleep a little bit when it comes to green technologies. China is, obviously it has raw materials, that gives it an advantage, but the technology that it has developed is good. Not all of it, but some of it is. So how do we protect our homegrown industries but still keep trade going? Because ultimately, if we shut out China completely, won't that create more antagonism, more tensions in a way? So Tarazara, maybe you...
This is a European question. I'm not a European, so I don't think I have an answer, but this EV question poses very different types of question. The first one is that there is a tendency for any country to try to protect your own domestic industry. I understand already in the US IRA, there is a strong incentives given for domestically produced EVs. This is understandable if we look at the politics. But contrast that with the international trade principle, which the US and European countries established through GATT and WTO. This free trade principle or policy helped the world grow after World War II. And this helped not just Germany and Japan, but many developing countries, emerging markets, they developed as a result of expansion of trade under this international trade norm, GATT or WTO. So the instinct to try to protect your own domestic industry in your EU, or already in the US, to protect your EV industry, would be in a very sharp contrast with the international norms that help the world grow, and as I said, was led by the US and Europeans. And this aspect, I think, would have to be discussed more, where it would be the balance between protecting your own domestic industry and try to realize the global economic growth through expansion of trade. This would apply to the CBAM, which Senator Whitehouse was so enthusiastic. I understand the rationale of having CBAM to avoid carbon leakage. That's fine. But for those who are not very familiar with CBAM, it's basically putting into place a de facto tariff on products coming from countries which did not put into place the carbon pricing at the level of EU. So from the carbon leakage, it is understandable. But from the trade perspective, it is adding a tariff to imports coming in from other parts of the world. And this argument of CBAM has a proliferating nature. The first proposal was like steel, aluminum fertilizer, and power. But now, like politics in the US, many sectors in the EU are lobbying to get the CBAM protection. Any products will be using CO2 somehow. Even the chairs are using CO2. So logically, anything that is produced could be subject to the CBAM. And already the CBAM covers bolts and screws because they use CO2. But frankly, to what extent bolts and screws would affect the global warming? And the CBAM would be applicable to any small import coming from any country. So the developing countries would have a difficulty making exports to the EU because of the CBAM, unless they have the carbon pricing at the level of the EU. CBAM would be applicable to Ukraine, for example, because Ukraine, prior to this invasion, had steel as their major exporting product. And since they don't have the carbon pricing at the level of the EU, they would be subject to the CBAM. So I don't have the answer to this, but this is where the climate consideration and the trade consideration, including the development and reconstruction of Ukraine, will be in a collision. And this is something I think we should start discussing, recognizing the legitimacy of having a CBAM type approach, but where do we strike the balance between another legitimate goal of expanding the global economy through trade? So this is something that I think we should start having discussion.
My reaction to that would be that and by the way, I support international trade. I'm a free trader, but GATT and the WTO and all of their measurements are based on the same flawed economic calculation that omits the harms of fossil fuel. There's a fundamental error in the calculations that support international trade as it relates to fossil fuel emissions. So you have to correct for that. Otherwise, countries become huge free riders with their pollution emissions, and the ones who are doing a good job, like the European Union countries, pay a price in what the professor called carbon leakage. You simply have to fix that. That is a fundamental error or defect in the plan. When you fix that, you then go back to the question of how do you adjust international trade, and you deal with all of those as international trade issues, and we have very robust conversations that deal with that. But the underlying fact that the entire operation is based on a flawed economic model in which the fossil fuel industry does not have its pollution harms baked into any of these calculations renders all of that, first of all, defective fundamentally, but also extremely, extremely dangerous when it comes to dealing with the climate risk that is increasingly prevalent.
Well,
So I think we're agreeing with each other. I just want to pick out from the trade discussion this question of the massive pollution subsidy.
I take your point, and the WTO was designed in 1995. GATT was in 1947, before all the discussion we're having today. And you're right, the current WTO or the GATT rules did not incorporate the environmental concern.
The negative externality.
At the time, the people were not discussing it. But WTO has a general exception to national security as well as measures taken on the basis of environmental objective. So that is already...
Which is why CBAM will work.
Yeah. Well, but with all the hundreds of pages of WTO, once you invoke this exception, as of now, there's no discipline or governance applied to measures taken on the basis of national security or environmental reasons. So I take your point that WTO was designed before these discussions, but we have a huge vacuum, no discipline, no rules, and this is what we have to start discussing. How do we make the balance between the environmental concerns that you're right to raise, but also the legitimate trade concerns, which helped Germany and Japan. We both lost the war. We were devastated by the war. But the only reason why Germany and Japan could recover was through trade. And this is the balance we would have to start discussing for the future generation, global climate and the global economic growth. That would have to be discussed.
Isn't that connected? Isn't that connected?
Well, it's connected. I'm saying that these would have to be put in together and to be discussed. But unfortunately, there's no discussion going on to make this argument. We have to make WTO updated and stronger, but without criticizing US, the WTO is not being functioning for various reasons, but one is that the dispute resolution system, the appellate body system, is paralyzed because we don't have the people being selected for the appellate body because US is opposed to the appointment. So the dispute resolution system is not functioning in WTO, but this is something I hope you can start. And this is not to deny your argument. We need to have an updated WTO, but at the time to make that happen, we need to have a functioning WTO.
I remember 10 years ago, we were saying in the Doha round that a breakthrough was just around the corner in the WTO. Well, it's been a very long corner. On the question of balance, there have been some discussions within the G7. Germany took some leadership on that during its presidency recently. Italy has it now. It's coming to us in 2025, and to some ways or thinking, there's always an incubation of ideas possibility in the seven, but then the seven has to not be seen as an elitist type organization when it takes this forward, for example, into a G20 context where there are members who might be diametrically opposed to certain approaches. So it has to be done carefully, and I think the elections, everyone talks about this year being a massive election year, which it is, and to bring in the European thing, the June elections to the European Parliament will be significant as a bit of a harbinger, but I think in Canada we fear that it will reflect a protest vote, as it often does, based on low participation and generally speaking the ennui felt by voters, whether it's the farmers who are protesting in Germany, France, and the Netherlands, are just people generally dissatisfied with institutions and wanting to exercise a protest vote. So that's something I think that's going to have to be watched very carefully as discussions go on. So you can do a lot of things in terms of statecraft, but at the end of the day, the people will have a voice as well.
I just wonder, I mean, I'm no expert on the WTO, but if you would, say, update the WTO, do you reckon that would actually reduce tensions, for example, with China? Is that something that one of you sees as a possibility? Because we also want to think about how do we, navigate sort of the geopolitics and the economics and the climate. It's big questions. But we do have some institutions, and I wonder what role they could play in, making the road a bit more smooth.
Well, we cannot solve all the geopolitical tension, but as I said, there's a WTO rule and all the general exceptions for national security and environmental reasons, and anything could be done. The former President Trump denied all the aspects of WTO because the US government at the time invoked the general exception. Rather than having a huge vacuum with no rules and no dispute resolution mechanism, it's much better to have the rules or discipline governing a new era, a new scope, which would include environmental policies and maybe including national security measures. It will not be as perfect and thorough as the hundreds of pages of the current WTO rule, but it is important to have principle and dispute resolution in place so that we can reduce the tensions among the great powers as we move towards this green transformation.
To the extent that we can, I think we need to observe what is happening within China. There's a period of deflation. Those who have wealth in China, that number might be affected by a downward spiral in the real estate market within. And the knock-on effect of that is perhaps not as much foreign investment as would be expected. So those are all levers and possible factors that could influence Chinese behavior as well.
Would you like to add something, Senator Martinez?
Well, you know, I come at this out of a law enforcement background, and I was on the Senate Intelligence Committee for quite a while during the time that our top intelligence officials were describing China's behavior with regard to America's intellectual property as the biggest theft in the history of mankind. That through cyber attacks and intrusions, through a whole variety of mechanisms, there was wholesale, massive theft of American intellectual property taking place and headed for China to support its economy, which was then subsidized to come back against us. So, you know, there are a lot of forces that come to bear between great powers, and trade, where it's monitored and affected by the WTO, is one piece of it, but there are a whole lot of other pieces. And I think that, let's just say, I'm not particularly sympathetic, having been on the receiving end of the greatest theft in the history of mankind, to too much concern. And when you look at the pollution side, the CBAM tariff on China is going to be about 3 times on the US. So the pollution levels are very, very high. And again, if we want to solve this problem for our planet, we have got to get serious about the indulgence of the fossil fuel industry's freedom to pollute. That just has to stop. And the most obvious way to do that without creating free riders is to have an international mechanism that prevents those free riders from getting away with it. And that's where the international tariffs come in, and that's why I think the CBAM is such important leadership. I'm thrilled that the UK has announced that it will join. I hope that other countries will as well. And I'm doing everything in my power to shove the Biden administration in the direction of taking a more positive view of participation in an international carbon pricing mechanism, which a tariff provides.
If I may add, you're mentioning free rider on the context of environmental issues, but the general criticism against China is that China has been free riding on the international free trade as well as the capability to steal and access technology. That's another free rider part of China. And getting back to your question, whether it would be legitimate to protect your own industry, even though their products may appear to be superior, would have to be put into this context. Assuming that their strength has been developed through those free riding, is it fair to give an equal access as the European domestic producers? That is another question. And maybe the rebalance of the results of those free riding could be addressed by some policies within Europe. And that's, I think, a possible argument. But once again, this will put tension against between those policies and the international current norm. So I think the WTO is not fully updated to deal with the externalities of environmental things, but also WTO is not designed to deal with the other free rider aspect, which may have to be put into the update of WTO. And the reason why the former President Trump did not like WTO is that his argument was that WTO was so effectless against China in giving free rider status to China. And although I do not agree with his argument, but he has some points in that. And WTO, in its update, would have to reflect the externalities, but at the same time also deal with those free riding aspects of the other aspects.
Now, clearly, the competition between the countries over new technologies is big. Would it be reduced when green energy were readily available, cheap for everyone? And when are we going to get there? How long is it going to take? Question to all of you, maybe, or one who has the first answer.
It's hard to know how that shift develops because it's a whole new economy that is emerging. So let's just say that investors would be willing to put very significant electric cables under the Mediterranean so that enormous amounts of Northern Africa could produce massive amounts of solar energy. And you could close down polluting factories as a result, and countries that are now very poor and in very difficult circumstances and involved in a lot of war and internal violence and conflict suddenly have the power providers for Europe. There are things like that I think emerge once you get the initial economic obstacles that have contorted decision making out of the way, and I think there's going to be a lot of opportunity for the global South in that equation. I don't think that you can go into that saying, well, they're going to be losers in all of this. I think there's a perfectly good argument that they'll actually be winners in all of this.
In Canada, we're looking at increasing production of modular nuclear reactors, so smaller ones, and we're exporting them as well. And I think too, the oil and gas industry is probably adapting more quickly and thinking more outside of the box than some people give them credit for, and certainly ahead of governments, at least at the provincial level. So it's hard to predict where this is going to go. There are subsidies and advantages, and we haven't talked about it yet. But there's also a lot of mis and disinformation out there, particularly in social media, and this tends to affect people's views. Governments, politicians will react to that, and I think that's a factor. Part of it is getting the message out, and there's so much confusion. It's not just domestically what you're doing to engender a more green economy, but what are you doing in cooperation with other countries? In our case, it's North America, but it's broader as well. How does that fit with the various trade agreements that are out there, regional in some cases, and not just bilateral? We talked about the WTO needing some strengthening and needing a greater sense of purpose, and then you have this entire other multilateral side on climate change, where there's all kinds of activities, whether it's the Global Green Fund or other things, where everybody is in the game and everybody wants to receive some of the benefits of funding that's out there as well. And then you try to distill that and get that through to the consumer. That is a very difficult task, I think.
I don't know when we will completely succeed in that transition, but probably among the advanced economies like US and Canada, EU and Japan, probably around 2050, we will get pretty close to realizing carbon neutrality, but the CO2 emission among those advanced economies is becoming much smaller in the share of the global GHG emission. I would assume, I don't have the figures with me, but probably in 2040s or so, probably 80% of the GHG will be coming out from the countries outside of the advanced economies. So it would be wrong if we just look the city of Munich and say, oh, well, everything is green. That's only part of the solution. So we have to have a global solution. And in that, I don't think we have been very successful in addressing the real interest of those countries. And also looking at what is actually happening. For example, China is now leading the world in the production of solar panels, and they are advancing in EVs. So they seem to be quite green on that regard. But at the same time, they are still constructing new coal-fired power plants, new ones. Excuse me? Yes. So it's not phasing out of coal-fired power plants as being discussed among the advanced economies. We agree on phasing out the coal-fired power plants among the advanced economies. But they are constructing new coal-fired power plants every week, and they will be in operation for 20 years or so. But this is not getting attention. So, and this will be the much larger scale of CO2, which would be at risk. But also we have to look at other global south countries in Africa or in Asia, which will be growing strongly, and they have a legitimate desire to elevate their living standards, which will result in massive energy demand. And that is where we need to work much better because this is a global planet issue. We need to have a global response.
If I might just quickly disagree with you on that, because I think a lot of people I meet in my line of work, the first thing that comes up a lot of the times when we're talking about climate policies is, oh, but China's building coal mines. So I think that is very much in people's minds when you talk to people. And when it comes to green technologies, again, it's not so much, or maybe not for everyone, it is so much about the green aspect, it's about the economic aspect, because they will be in high demand around the world. And the question is, who's going to be selling them? Who's going to be making the big money? And I wonder, because, you know, in Europe, and maybe in the US and Canada, we've been asleep for a little bit when it comes to those technologies, or they've been stolen. But I wonder, how long do we need to protect, or are we protecting our industries well enough to you know, create that kind of economic advantage again? Are we doing enough? And is the downside of that, though, that relation? So the better we are at protecting our economies, the worse our relationship with China gets. Is that what we're looking at? What can we do to change that? If that is the case?
I don't think you can answer those questions accurately on a platform of climate failure and economic distortion. You have to correct that first. That changes things economically in the world, and then you adjust to the world as it properly is, with negative externalities actually counted. And things will change when that happens, and then you can make the adjustments. But we can get the trade aspects wrong, and there will be quarrels, and there will be disputes, and there will be rancor, and it will sort itself out, and life will go on. We get the climate part wrong, and life does not go on in the normal, predictable way. We go into a very dangerous new era of human habitation of this planet. And so you can't put those two things side by side. You have to solve the violation of economic law by the fossil fuel industry first, and then off of that platform, you can then make the trade adjustments that are needed. There will be winners and losers in that transition, and then you can make the adjustments off of that. But I think it's folly to make trade adjustments now standing on a platform that is so riddled with that basic defect that this massive, 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 massive planetary harm is completely ignored by the economics of the way we consider these things.
Okay, so for example, if there be a really big trade dispute between China and the US, and China says, all right then, we'll just park another big warship in front of Taiwan, or, you know, beef up our presence in the South China Sea. I mean, that's when trade isn't just, you know, when it isn't just confined to its economics, but it actually spills into real political clashes.
True, and those clashes have been resolved by politics, by conflicts, by economic reprisals, by all sorts of resolutions, by innovation to get around it over time. I think that those trade conflicts, as countries clash about their economic imperatives, are more or less of a constant. And what the WTO and trade did was put a kind of general structure for that to have those resolved, but they haven't gone away. We've had massive trade and economic conflicts even under this regime. It's just been in a better place. But the climate issue and the economic flaw that undergirds all of it is, I think, going to be a lot more dangerous in the near term than quarrels between different nations that are predicated on pricing and trade issues.
Senator Beam, I wonder, because climate is, you know, a global issue, do you think it actually provides an opportunity for people, for countries to overcome their political tensions and to, you know, work together instead of clashing more? Or is that naive?
No, it's not, and I think about that a lot, and you know, we witness every year the largest gathering, international gathering in the world is the Conference of Parties meeting on climate change. And there's a communique that's issued, and there's a little bit of progress made. This year there was declaratory language regarding the eventual phase out of fossil fuels. But in reality, and I agree with my senatorial counterpart from the United States, the companies are still calling the shots, and the use of fossilized fuel or fossil fuels is going to continue for some time. We can project an optimistic scenario of 2050 or 2035, and there has been progress, but the reality is different. And as to the weaponization of trade, that's been around for a long time. And I know in my experience in the G7 as a Sherpa or personal representative, just a few years ago, we were looking at a mechanism where we could deal with steel from China. So some of that was done in the OECD context, and we came up with a draft mechanism, and it looked like the US was on board, and then was not. And the solution was to impose steel and aluminum tariffs on all of the other G7 members. So that didn't work so well. So sometimes we can do what is called in German an Eigentor, shooting the ball, or in our case, the puck, into your own net. And I think we have to be wary of that as well in terms of trying to plan in policy terms.
One last question for you, Mr. Tarzan. Japan is a big economy, small country, neighbour to China. How does Japan protect its economy and at the same time keep good relations with China? How do you... Maybe is there something we can learn?
Well, I wish we had the answer. China is our neighbor. It has been our neighbor, and it continues to be our neighbor. It's huge. It's huge. We cannot think of not having trade with China. China is our largest trade partner. And many companies make their profits in China. So that's one reality. The other reality is China weaponizing their leverage they have on Japan and other countries, including Australia, and trying to push whatever political objective they are pursuing. So we have to live in these two contrasting reality that we're facing. And it's difficult, But what we are trying to do is that to deal with the threat of being under economic coercion, we need to reduce our dependence on China, especially for the avoiding the over dependence on certain inputs, including critical minerals as well as chips. But that will be narrowly focused. You cannot predict everything. For shoes, we are okay to buy shoes from China, for example. But if it's some kind of high-tech sensitive products like chips, we may have our second thoughts. So having a relatively clearly defined, a relatively small field, and make sure that we don't become over-dependent, so that we'll be vulnerable for weaponization of that dependence. At the same time, we try to expand our relationship with China. This balance is very difficult, but we understand China has an incentive in keeping the relationship with other countries. Now, when you look at newspapers, including your paper, we are seeing a serious slowdown in the economic activities of China. And in the US stock market, as well as the Japanese stock market, we're making record high rise in the stock market. But Chinese stock market is dropping significantly. The engines that have led China has been under problem. The first is the real estate market. It helped the local governments, even the national governments, to finance their spending. It helped the households feel rich. That engine is broken. Another engine is that the constant inflow of investment from outside of China, that is slowed down substantially. So if they lose these two engines, their economy will be in pretty bad shape. And the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party is coming out from economic growth, making people rich. That is the strongest legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party. But with the potential of losing these two engines, it's not just an economic problem. It could turn into a serious political question. So that would lead China to try to get investment from outside of China. And that is a potential area in which we can work with China, try to expand our relationship while keeping some sectors from being over-dependent on China. This is delicate, but we see an opportunity because China facing the prospect of losing its two engines of growth.
Thank you very much. I think that very much feeds into what is talked about in Germany a lot as well about de-risking, not just decoupling, but de-risking. I'd like to open up the floor to some questions from the public. There's a couple, so we'll start with the gentleman in second row, please.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Great to be here. China, which is on everybody's mind here in terms of the discussion. We look to the World Trade Organization as an organization that was setting rules and regulations to which China adheres to very few. That's first. Number two, China subsidizes all of its industries. Number three, every corporation that you're actually dealing with in China is actually a state-run enterprise or has influence thereof. And we're trying to solve a problem with climate change where they are opening up a coal-fired plant and India is doing the same. And we are trying to fight a battle with a company or an organization that is not going to play by any of the rules that we want to set. They're also using slave labor to produce all of those solar panels, and we are not holding them to account. So I'd like to see how we're going to move forward on serious climate change when we are affected by an organization or a state-run enterprise that ultimately at every different level is undermining our fair trade policy, fair trade perspective. How do we work with China in the future? Because we need to have them on board in solving climate change. but are they going to play the game? Are they going to play by the rules? So I leave that to the panel.
I would, on behalf of the two senators here, make the observation that it's very hard to solve economics with politics. They operate in different spheres. You can use the politics to fix the economics, so you solve the economics, but it takes economics to fix economics. And I do think that the CBAM and these price signals into China are very powerful and significant and will have real economic effects. And while we think of those, just to put a, or more of a positive, we think of a tariff as being suppressive. You know, you're gonna add a tariff, the price is gonna go up, people will buy less of it, so there's less harm. That's part of it. The other part of it is that the company paying the tariff, let's say it's paying $1 billion a year tariff, now has a $999 million incentive to innovate and reduce that tariff and to do it as efficiently as possible. And so the price signal, not only as a discouraging factor, but also as an inducement to innovate, is really powerful, and you can't legislate that stuff. You just can't. You can't get that close to the decision making, and it really takes changing the economic terms. And when the economic terms we're presently under are in a flagrant violation of the most basic principles of economics, it makes the fix pretty straightforward.
Or if you're going to look at political agreement, you have to be somewhat in solidarity. And I recall when the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank was established, there was a tacit agreement among the G7 countries to be involved in the writing of the Articles of Agreement and work together in that regard. And I don't know if this is working properly, but at the end of the day, the Europeans went in first. And
maybe you want to switch. Do you want to like?
Mine wasn't working.
right here. Okay, well, I'll try the American mic now. So the European countries went in first. Japan, U.S., Canada held back. We eventually went in late. We took part of the Brazilian share to do that. But again, there was an attempt there that failed. So I agree with Senator Whitehouse that it's very difficult to find political solutions to this. And I don't think if there are political solutions, I can't think it would be just one country that could do it, even if it is the U.S. It would have to be across the board, and that would be almost impossible to achieve.
If I can add, I agree completely with my fellow panelists' argument. I think China is very good in divide and rule. They have picked someone against them, and they pick others in support. We have to be united, and we have to be like-minded and with a common voice to tell China that their behaviors may not be acceptable for various reasons. It could be CO2 emission, it could be the state subsidy, whatever, or slavery. And they would have to get that same message from every player that matters. If they hear different stories, they may feel okay. And to be very honest with my European friends and the German friends, until a few years ago, China was getting a different message from Germany. And that let them go along, saying that they can go on free riding because they don't get any criticism just from US, Canada, and Japan. But Europeans were friends with China. And that is something I think this Munich Security Conference can start making this discussion. It started with the transatlantic relationship, but nothing is limited to transatlantic. It is global. So if there are actions or policies or whatever that is not acceptable, we should speak strongly and forcefully together, backed by actions. My regret is that when Australia was hit by their ban on the import of Australian wine, just because of saying that we need to have a study into the cause of COVID-19, my regret is that we didn't support Australia. In retrospect, we should start buying Australian wine. At the time, we might have lose the consumption of California wine, Canadian wine, but for the time being, we have to support each other. When one country is attacked, we have to support. And there's also sometimes disinformation. We have to defend our friends, which might be target of those trade sanctions and also disinformation. We have to unite with our words and with our actions.
But can I just ask something related to that? Doesn't that make China feel even more, or represent itself as being ganged up upon, and it feeds the kind of victim almost, the victim feeling, and that's also something that maybe countries in the global south can also relate to. So it's. I wonder, it was Russia too who said, "Oh, we're being ganged up upon," Can that not lead? Does that not also have its dangers to say that?
Well, I think you made a good point that we have to work not among the advanced economies. We have to have the global south, countries like India and others, in support of our argument and concern. If the global south does not side with us, it's a classic divide and rule. So when I say like-minded countries, it's not limited to the advanced economies. We have to go to our Asian neighbors and other neighbors to let China understand that the world is not accepting their behaviors. It may make them feel much more isolated, but today they're feeling that they can go along okay. So which is better? They are pragmatic people. If they understand whatever they're pursuing is not in line with their future, they are pragmatic people. They would change course. But as of today, they feel that they can go ahead without being penalized. That's a problem.
Thank you. Now, a question in the third row. Could you pass the mic here? Sorry. Yeah, fantastic.
Thank you very much. First, thank you all for your very interesting comments and discussion. I want to connect this to the thing I heard by the Dean of the SAIS at Johns Hopkins in a lecture earlier. He talked about regional versus international institutions and how sometimes the regional institutions in our current global climate and our global institutions with weak institutions that you touched upon frequently, how those can be more effective at getting where we want to go. And you've also talked about a lot about the global south. So the question there is maybe looking after one global institution that gets our point, maybe not the right point, but instead looking after several regional institutions, all with the same goals. You mentioned CBAM as a point specifically, looking after many of those to get the signal going, to get the ball rolling. In the meantime, as a faster way to progress, the better choice, instead of looking at the World Trade Organization saying this is flawed, we need to reform this. That would be my question to all of you.
Well, particularly if you can start regionally right away and you have to wait for this global solution to magically manifest itself at some point. Where you can win and where you can move, you have to win and you have to move. And our experience in the United States has been that the fossil fuel industry's political pressure has mostly been at the national level. It's now moved further down, but we set up in New England, RGGI it's called, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, and off it went. It's done very well, and the fossil fuel industry really wasn't there to fight it very hard in the same way that they fight in Congress. So you can come in sort of under the political opposition of this industry more effectively, I think, at the local level as well.
I think a lot of the discussion that is taking place in global institutions is being replicated to some degree in regional and other organizations. In the case of Canada, we belong to every regional other organization on the planet, partly traditionally to offset our overwhelming bilateral relationship with our southern neighbor and also our history. So we're in the Commonwealth, we're in La Francophonie, and these discussions are taking place there at a smaller level. These are not as well endowed. These institutions, we are arguably the second largest contributor, and there are others there. But that's where some of these discussions take place, especially on the issue of the future of small island states. In our case, the Caribbean and their they're our neighbors and they have similar political institutions. So I think that is helpful. To what extent there is some reverse osmosis, I don't know, but certainly everyone is having similar discussions.
I agree with you. We cannot just wait for the international institution to be stronger. We have to do everything at every layer possible. It could be regional within a country, and it could be regional, Asian-wide as well, and it can be beyond region. For example, Japan is engaged in Quad. Quad is Japan, USA, Australia, India. It's more or less regional, but beyond being region. So at various levels, I think we can work together and to deal with the global climate change and providing a regional solution, and also to deal with the geopolitics. That Quad mechanism has been quite effective. So we have to do efforts at every level.
More questions? Yeah. One more.
Just a few comments as well. Thank you for the discussion. Going back to China, the issues of China, which is that economic coercion can only work if you control strategic sectors. And I don't see that happening on China, because firstly, China controls most of the important strategic materials needed for the green transition, photovoltaics, but also the rare minerals, as well as germanium and refining processes. And we don't see the same development that's happening in Europe and America, because China as a whole is spending, the green investment in China is combining both the green investments in both the EU and the United States combined. So I'm not seeing the political will coming from Europe and US to pursue green transition in the same scale in that sense. And this is also going to affect the global south, or the so-called global south, which is a collection of heterogeneous states, because the global south countries need these materials. They need partners that are taking the green transition very seriously. And in a sense, most of the export market for photovoltaics are coming from China, not coming from Europe. So what do you think Europe and America should double down on in the end? Industrial policies or continuing a trade war with China?
I think you have a good point. Unless we can present an alternatives to the global south, they would just say the only means is getting the products from China. So that is the natural tendency in the absence of alternatives. And this is exactly what happened with the Belt and Road Initiative. China was the only major source of funding for infrastructure. For the global south told us that while they understand some of the concerns surrounding Belt and Road Initiative, China provided a vast amount of financing for the infrastructure development, so the global south had to lean towards China. So you're right. With all the arguments we may have, we have to show the alternatives in reality. And in order to do so, no single country, US is a huge country, but compared with some of the size, US alone may not be enough. EU is large, but EU in itself is not large enough. I think in order to provide an alternative, competitive alternative, we have to have an economy of scale which could be comparable to China. I'll give you just one data. Looking at the recent deployment of renewable energies globally, recently, 60% are taking place in China, 40% the rest of the world. So it's, in terms of scale, for the clean energy, it's China and the rest of the world. If among the rest of the world, each player tries to do its own efforts, limited to its own players, US, EU, Japan, individually, will not be able to provide a competitive alternatives. So I think our response would have to be beyond your own territory. And with all the benefits of IRA, one of the problems I find is IRA is trying to solve this through US alone. I think it's better for us to get united, and have the economy scale to be able to provide a competitive advantage, alternative.
Okay, I think that's all we've got time for today. There's a lot of information. Thank you so much for being here today. Thank you so much also for the audience's questions. They were brilliant, and I hope you had a fantastic. I hope it was great for you too. And yeah, thank you so much. And if you have any questions, maybe they have. They'll be hanging around for a bit.
So, thank you very much, gentlemen. Thank you very much, Emily. My name is Robin. I'm one of the board members of the German Association. We're right here at the program office, so thank you very much, the team of the America House, for hosting us, for working in the last 5 weeks, a lot of hours, a lot of calls, a lot of emails. So I hope you learned a lot about the discussion we had. Make sure to follow America House and the German Association on LinkedIn and all other social media, so you learn much more what we are doing. And sign up for the newsletter, and hopefully see you soon around in one of the next events. Thank you very much.